Hey y'all, I'm just going to very quickly show you in this video basically a proof that gross domestic product is effectively the equivalent to gross domestic income in the economy, and I'm going to prove this really with the U.S. economy in 2019 with some estimates of GDP versus some estimates of GDI. I also want to show you that the GDP components have kind of like not precise but common sense equivalents to the GDI components, and that's why it shouldn't be surprising that these are the same. And I'm just going to give you a quick little note on why or how measuring GDP is a little different from measuring GDI when it comes to government. So first, let's start off with the components. You can see the GDP components are government purchases, which is revenue from taxation and borrowing, and it's usually also accompanied in a closed economy by personal consumption by households and gross private investment by firms. In an open economy, there is also the inclusion of net exports, which are the exports of the economy to outside economies minus the imports that the economy does from outside economies. On top of that, or in comparison to that, we have GDI components. And the GDI components are employee compensation, profits, net interest, rental income, depreciation, and indirect taxes. So employee compensation kind of self-explanatory. The profits component is really profits from firms. So whatever you get after considering all expenses in the firm, right? You take your revenue, subtract expenses. We're gonna, in a very basic sense, assume that the difference between that are the earnings that should be profits for households to collect. Net interest, which should effectively capture interest payments flowing in the economy. Rental income, so any income generated from the renting of capital sources or capital resources, things along those lines, and depreciation, which is value of capital assets, the deterioration of that value over time through the use of those capital assets. There's kind of we have to account for that in this accounting for income, and you'll start to understand in a moment why. But the fact is that gross private investment, in part, is investment to replace depreciated capital. So to some extent, we have to take into consideration depreciation and in this formulation, and indirect taxes, which are more so equivalent to like things like sales tax that do not require demographic information, are just collected usually through transactions in the economy. So let's look at these components, GDI and GDP for 2019. You can see we're looking at them over here, GDP versus GDI for 2019. GDP components, real government consumption and expenditures totaled 3.3 almost $trillion. Oh yes, these dollar amounts are in billions. So when you see, for example, 19,045, that's 19,045 billion, or in other words, 19,045 billion. So rounding government consumption expenditures up, it's at 3.3 trillion for the United States. Real consumption and expenditures was 13 point almost 3 trillion as well in the United States. Real gross domestic investment was 3.4 trillion. And because we're looking at the United States now as a whole open economy, we would also compare real net exports, which for the United States was a negative $954 billion in 2019 in real terms. Now, we don't have a comparative government component to look at because indirect taxes would not be would have already been accounted for in the other components that we're going to take a look at. And because they would have already been accounted for in these components, because we're looking at these components as far as the income that the factors themselves can produce at their cost, which means that we are already taking into consideration whatever government would have taxed from this in determining these values. So we do not include indirect taxes here because indirect taxes are already built into these other components. That might be a little bit more on the advanced side. It doesn't really, for everybody else who's not trying to dig into the depths of how national income accounting works in the US, all you need to understand is that for our intents and purposes, we would look at all these components aside from indirect taxes in GDI, and this should be comparable to the GDP components, and you'll see in a second that it is. So national income, which would be compensation of employees. So we're looking now at an employee compensation variable. Employee compensation was about $8.6 trillion in 2019. Real employee compensation, by the way, is what we're looking at here. Real corporate profits before tax was at almost 8, but around $6.765 trillion in 2019. Net interests and other miscellaneous payments came in at around $433 billion. $612 billion was generated in rental income. And current cost depreciation of assets was valued at around $2.5 trillion, almost $2.6 trillion. So to get at the part of GDP where private investment is accounting for corporations replacing the capital assets that they've used, you would have to have an idea of how much depreciation has happened in the economy to understand how much income is being generated from just the replacement of capital assets. And what we see here is that the total between the two, as it was given away at the very top, is almost identical, right? There's probably a slight statistical difference between the two. Of course, GDP will be re-estimated. I'm pretty sure this has already been re-estimated since these numbers that I'm looking at. But GDP will be re-estimated. But what you'll see is that even as re-estimates of both of these variables happen, they'll be within only a couple tens less of billions of dollars between each other, right? This 45 and 38 is very, very similar. And that's really probably a statistical difference in how all these components, which if you look at them, there's a lot of components, are actually measured and then compared to each other. Okay, so that concludes the proofing of the comparisons between GDP and GDI. Hopefully the takeaway here is that GDP and GDI, gross domestic product, and gross domestic income are very similar measures for the output of an economy. You can see some of the reasons why, because they kind of cover similar areas of what we're looking at for an economy, right? They overlap almost entirely, one would assume. Obviously entirely, if these numbers are so similar to each other. And this means that there are multiple ways then to try to measure the output of an economy. You could try to measure it through the value added method, where you basically try to look at where value is added in supply chains to try to get at a total output for the economy, or you could look at it through some of the variables that you may collect in your process of collecting tax information. So things like employee compensation, profits, interest, rental income, depreciation, sales tax. These are all values that we kind of have a number for in government just by the process of government and the process of government trying to collect revenue. So that also offers a way for governments to measure the output for their economy. All right, y'all. Have a good one.